I spent a bit of time getting acquainted with my wheelbarrow when I was working on refilling the trench. The wheelbarrow is nothing special. In fact, I didn't even choose it. It was left behind by Bob when we bought the house. It does work perfectly fine, but it was in quite a sad state cosmetically. And it's always parked outside of my workshop window, so I'm always staring at how bad condition it's in. I guess I was inspired by the bodywork that I managed to successfully do on my Vespa, because I thought giving it a clean up and a fresh lick of paint would be a fun job that wouldn't take very long. I had been entertaining the idea of refinishing the barrow for a long time. I didn't just want to do it a flat colour, but I also didn't want to make it as intense as the workshop doors. For a while I was thinking of doing it like this paper folder I made a couple of years ago. But now I was thinking about actually doing the job. I realised wrapping a design like that around the barrow's compound trapezium shape would send the curves in unpredictable dimensions. I got dismantling the barrow anyway. Unsurprisingly, all the bolts were rusted stuck. And the heads of the nuts were all concreted in too, so there was nothing to stop them from just spinning. I tried the e-chisel and that felt like it was going nowhere, so I decided there was no point in saving the bolts anyway, and I got the angle grinder out. It was messy, but it made short work of them, and it allowed me to separate the frame from the tub. After being surprised at how easy it was to sand the Vespa back to bare metal, I thought stripping this back was going to be easy with the power tools as well. I was so wrong. I tried my palm sander and it did remarkably little. So the next thing I tried was a wire wheel, which was only a little more effective. I was nowhere near bare metal still, so I decided to try and use some rust remover I already had knocking around in the workshop. I painted it on an area of the tub and I left it overnight. Then when I rinsed it all off, I was actually pretty shocked at how well it worked. Encouraged by how well the rust remover went, it was time to go heavy duty with the sanding. It was flap disc time. This worked really well, but it created crazy amounts of dust. I was sure glad to be wearing my respirator. I gave it another coat of rust remover and left it overnight again, before giving it a thorough rinse off. Even after such a thorough rinsing, when it dried it left this powdery residue over the barrow. And this time the wire wheel was perfect to clean that out. The rust was definitely not eliminated at this point, so I decided to do an initial coating of paint over the barrow with a direct to rust primer, which may or may not prove to be a good idea. When it was dry, it really highlighted how pitted the surface was from all of the rust, so I let the project take a little turn for the silly here. I figured that because I had almost the entire can of body filler left from the Vespa repair, I'd do a little trial of putting some onto the wheelbarrow. I sanded the filler up and it felt really easy in comparison to trying to sand the rust off, so I slathered up the whole tub with filler. I think this was about the point that I realised I was putting far too much effort into a rusty old wheelbarrow. It was noisy work, and it ended up taking longer than I expected to sand all the filler smooth. I kind of weirdly liked the patina that was left behind from the sanding, but I decided I couldn't reasonably leave it like that, and I gave it another coat of the straight to rust paint. After that I put on some grey primer that was left over from the Vespa repair, which my overhead camera failed to record, and it was looking pretty good. I used up the can, which I was pretty happy about at the time. The tub still had plenty of character from all the dents and how bent it was, but it was a bit smoother now at least, so I gave the grey primer a going over with some wet and dry paper before the next coat. I had ended up settling on a heraldic bend of sorts for the design, as I thought that would wrap around the bucket's shape in interesting ways. I had a lot of cans of blue paints left over from an old record cover I made. And I also had this can of metallic teal from this picture of a duck I made for Lily last year. But I wanted to pick out a new colour for the middle stripe. For some reason I had in my mind the creamy beige.
Do you like Baileys?
Of a German taxi cab. But what I think I ended up with was just a little too on the creamy side of beige for that. Again, the overhead camera seemed to not want to record that initial stripe. This can of paint was coming out particularly funny as well, leaving a yellowy dust on the surface. So I gave it a really good sanding and then another coat of paint to try and tidy it up. I masked up the stripe I wanted, then I looked around in the recycling for something to build a wall of sorts out of, finding a flour bag from Lily's bakery. The idea was to be able to paint the two colours at the same time without having to wait for one to dry and to remask it. I started with a greeny teal colour, and after an initial once-over, I worried that it was going to prove too transparent and need completely repriming again. I swapped over and tackled the blue on the other side, which was really successful. Then by the time I was done with that, the green side had begun to dry and looked a lot better than I thought it was going to. Good enough to just go ahead and paint the rest of it. I gave it a second coat, then after that was done, I noticed that the paint had completely blistered around the bottom edges. I decided I couldn't live with it, so I sanded it all back and cleaned it up, which got Frisbee's attention. Once I got it smooth, I thought I had better hit it with the rust paint again. And having finished up the grey primer earlier in the project, I gave the rust paint a coat of the green. This was a bit of a disaster. The green paint globbed up on it rather than going smooth, which I guess taught me that the blistering was probably also from the rust paint. I sanded it back again, wondering for the third time why I was putting so much effort into a bashed up wheelbarrow. Then I realised that I needed some more grey primer for when I was doing the legs anyway. So much for my pride in finishing up the last can. The green paint went down a lot better on the grey primer, and after a second coat it looked seamless enough with the rest of it. With all the coloured paint dry, it was time for the rewarding bit, which was removing the masking tape. This went great, except for where it didn't, and it peeled off a load of my cream paint. I masked off the damaged area, sanded it, put some more filler in, and wondered for the fourth time why I was doing this. The filler worked well though, and as I had to repaint a part of it, I decided I may as well hit the entire stripe with another blast of paint. Once that was dry, it was time for the last detail of the tub. I wanted to add a black line between the three stripes. I got that all masked off and sprayed up very effectively. Black is always a quick reward to put down. And using the sensitive masking tape on my newly painted surfaces saved me from any more disasters. That was pretty much it for the tub, short of giving it a blast of clear lacquer now my stripy design was done. So I turned my attention to the legs. I found more rusty bolts on the wheel attachment, which despite having their heads less filled with cement, I still couldn't get enough purchase on them to free the nuts. I ended up doing what I did with the tub, which is more awkward angle grinding, and that went better on the second side than it did on the first. I got the wheel free anyway, and having learned from the process with the tub, I went straight in with a flat disc to clean it up. It also got a coat of rust converter and a rinsing, and leaving it to dry in the sun showed me that it was still pretty rusty under there anyway. I finally decided that I'd already put far too much time into sanding all the rust away, so I cleaned up all the grinding dust and gave it a really lazy coat of the rust primer. These legs were much harder to paint nicely than the big surface of the tub, so I sanded away the drips and I blasted it with grey primer. When the primer dried, I went at it with a slightly malfunctioning leftover can of black paint, and that only got me so far. I finished it with a can of the other Montana, which I was actually quite impressed with. Because the support struts were small, I ended up cleaning them up on the wire wheel on the pillar drill. I had just enough rust paint left over for these, and then they got a coat of the black as well. The wheel, unsurprisingly, was an unnecessary energy sink too. I started by trying to take the tyre off, and trying to lever it off showed me just how brittle the plastic rim had become. So I abandoned that idea. I gave it a bit of a scrub with some wire brushes, then attacked it with the pressure washer, which was much more effective. I had enough blue paint left over, so I gave it a coat of primer and then a coat of blue, and I decided that was enough effort for a crumbly old plastic wheel, and pumped the tyre back up again. I ordered some new bolts, and with all the effort I'd put into it, I decided to indulge in stainless hardware. I got some really big flat stainless washers to hopefully make up for the weakest spots in the tub. I miscounted how many bolts I needed, so I ended up putting the last 2 bolts into the support struts when they arrived a couple of days later. As much as I found I was asking myself, why did I do this? Why did I think this was a good idea while I was working on this project? I am really glad that I did it. It looks about as good as I hoped it would, and I think I'm going to be hard pressed to find a better looking wheelbarrow now. Despite the amount of effort that I put into it, it still does have loads of character. I'm not really here to make a judgment on whether it was worth saving or not, but I have saved it, and hopefully it will stand up to hanging around outside a little bit better now. It was completely mad, but like most projects I try, I am really glad that I did it. I do think it looks really good, and it's much nicer to look at outside of my workshop window now. Thank you for watching my video.